Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the SCS webinar on food safety and harnessing the power of independent verification to speak to your customers. That's the name of our webinar series. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about FDA, or specifically FDA, but more common any sort of compliance enforcement, and then how that dovetails in with GFSI standards and support to stay ready for regulatory compliance and obviously compliance to your GFSI standards. So great to see a lot of names that I recognize on the attendee list, names that our panelists will also be recognized, so past colleagues and clients and current clients as well. So welcome everybody. We've got a great broad section of industry representation. We've got from the farm to the fork. We've got in between and manufacturing and distribution. So a broad stroke of different types of people, different roles that are obviously looking for some more information on where those GFSI standards kind of dovetail with regulation. What's happening with regulations and changes? And there's always change in the food industry, as you know, and very difficult to sometimes get a handle on that and get a handle on what you need to do and what you don't need to do and those sorts of things. So looking forward to spending some time with you today. So let's get started. So this is me, Frank Schurz. So I'm with SCS Global Services, Director of Strategic Accounts and Business Development. Have been in the food industry for, hate to admit it, but 35 years, or over 35 years now. And but in many different roles as an auditor, a consultant, business certification body owner, and all those sorts of things. So, but today my role is a moderator. I'm going to be having my panel of esteemed colleagues from SCS join me, and we've got some, it's a panel discussion around some of the issues around compliance and enforcement, and specifically how that, again, that dovetails into GFSI standards and training and customer support and all those other things that are important to you, the practitioners that are out there with dealing with it, regulations and different compliance that way, as well as your customers and what they're asking for. So lots of things happening there. So a couple things, yeah. So this is our first webinar in a series. At the end, I'll be talking a little bit more around further webinars in our series that you might want to get on your calendar, and we hope to see you on further ones. But this is kind of our launch for the 2022 series of doing that. Okay, so a couple of some of you may be new to SCS. Some of you are current clients or have worked with some of our services before. So just a little bit of a background on again who we are. We're headquartered in North America in California, Emeryville, California. Staff all over the world, primarily in the Americas, but with the expansion of some of our other services in different divisions under sustainability and natural resources. We're getting to lots of different parts of the globe and servicing a lot of different clients in a lot of different industries. So a little bit about that, and that comes from over 40 years in the business, starting with a lot of pesticide-specific residue testing and certification back in the day, then obviously expanding that into other aspects of food and agriculture and natural resources and climate services and all those sorts of things. So lots of new additions. We're growing very quickly and really starting to see a lot of the bundling and the cross over with some of our clients into all of our service provisions, and I think that's beneficial to all when you can service that and meet the needs of the clients out there, and your needs specifically, because they're always changing. So in terms of the food and agriculture services, these are the primary services that we're offering. You see that are all the food safety audits, so all the GFSI benchmark standards are listed there, both in the ag space and further up into the supply chain. We've got a labeling service that food labeling, where we look at gluten-free and the non-GMO project and organic certification. And then we have our sustainability agriculture that looks at both sustainability practices on the farm and up into the rest of the supply chain, as well as social compliance around, worker and employee needs out there, SMETA being a big part of that. So you can see that with the conversion of these three, I call them the tripod of services for food and ag. They can be all within your realm of what you need to be doing out there, or one or the other. But and some of them deal, and actually all of them interact at some point with compliance. I mean, we're going to be focusing on food safety compliance and how that interacts with GFSI, but the sustainability and social compliance aspects and labeling, because labeling is a regulatory aspect as well, they all come into play when we're looking at that. So in terms of today, what we're going to be doing is kind of bundling our questions. So we've got a bank of questions. I've got a bank of questions that I'm going to be asking the panelists, and I'll be inviting them to join me shortly. And that bank of questions is kind of split into three different categories, and it all deals with regulatory and regulatory issues. So recalls are a regulatory issue because obviously they may initiate it, you may initiate it, but at some point it's out there in the public domain and needs to be dealt with. So we've got some questions on recalls and how training provisions, how the certification body, how the auditors work with recall information. So we'll have some questions around that. Enforcement piece, obviously, there's regulation, it's being enforced. So what's happening, when enforcement and you're engaging with enforcement, how does, what are some things that you need to do, obviously, with respect to your regulatory authority, but also, what's the interaction with the CV, or the certification body, or you need to learn more about enforcement and how to deal with that. So we've got some questions around enforcement. And then the last, chunk of that is in changes and additions to regulations. How does that manifest itself in the training programs, into the standards that we certify to, and how do we communicate all that? So there's lots of different forms of communication that are required between you and your regulatory authority and you, the site, and the CV. And what are some best practices around that to deal with all the enforcement stuff? So those are the three bundles, and I'll look to be keeping that sort of listing up on the screen while we get to the panelists. So that's next. So I would ask the panelists to come on screen and get your video cams going and bring them into the fold here and ask them to introduce themselves. Great. Okay, there's everybody. Smiling faces, ready to go. 10, we're sitting in some nice comfy chairs. You got a comfy chair, and we're just sort of shooting up. Oh, I can't say that word, but we're having fun and asking some questions and dealing with some stuff going on. So, we've got we've got training, certification body and technical support, and our operations team here to talk to you. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Radojka, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm currently the director for food safety training, but prior to coming on board with SCS Global Services, I worked in the food industry for 18 years in several roles in the quality assurance areas. I worked for several food industry sectors, including dairy, juice. I stayed in juice for 12 years, so I consider myself very well versed on juice hazard. And then I work also for carbonated soft drinks, water, bottling, and hot tea operations. Again, all in quality assurance, going from technician all the way to director positions and SQF practitioner in some cases. So thank you for being here and welcome.
Right, so Radojka is going to be tackling all those questions on training, and then sometimes because that very specific regulatory aspects and regulatory requirements around training. So good to have her on board. So Anthony, why don't you go next?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the senior technical manager here at SCS. So I'm in charge of the certification programs for BRC, FSSC, SQF, our GMP programs, and then some of our customer specific audits. I've been with SCS now for getting closer to a year. I think I started in April of 2021. And then before that, I was a full-time auditor with NSF for about 5 years. And then before that, I worked in a number of different sites for Mars Incorporated and Mondelez, all in quality and food safety management roles. And altogether, I've got about, I think it's 15 or 16 years now total in all of food safety. So again, really glad that looks like we have a pretty good turnout today. So looking forward to answering any of your questions and having some good conversations.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Jessica, you're up.
Hi, hello, welcome everybody. My name is Jessica Caputo and my title is Director for Operations of Food Safety. I work with all of the folks on this call as well as our sales and operations teams to make sure we have a really good, smooth experience and awesome time with our clients. I have been with SCS for just over 12 years. This is my first webinar that I have been a part of, so I'm very excited about that. And I look forward to hearing what lively discussion we have regarding these topics.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks to have you all aboard and look to answer the questions. So I'm just going to back this slide up one more, get back to there, so we have it in the background. So if you have questions, as we go through our questions and they elicit some thought and questions that you might have, please go to the questions box, not the chat box. Go to the questions box in your panel over to your right there, and you can type questions in. I'll be looking at that as we move forward. If there's a couple come up, I'll stop and I'll ask some of those questions along with the ones that I currently have in my deck of questions for these three panelists. You can state the panelists you want to answer it if you want, or just leave it general. But please do that as we move forward, or come to the end. But at the end of this, we'll also be checking to make sure that we've got those questions. Some of you had submitted some questions upon registration. We've got a note of those, and if applicable or where we can, we'll be sticking some of those in as well. So let's hopefully be this as interactive as you can be. I know you can't talk. A lot of you like to talk, probably as much as I do. But that would be very chaotic. So we don't.
I don't know about that, Frank.
So okay, well, let's get going then. Yeah. So recalls. I mean, anybody, you can type FDA recalls, and just over the last 2 months, we got Listeria monocytogenes in ice cream and mushrooms. So we've got the Indorag stuff happening. We've got it up in dairy. We've got salmonella in onions and leafy greens. Again, we've got some Indorag there. And some field stuff. Got lead in plums. It was lead. Oh, don't worry about lead. Yeah, ask the people in Flint. Yeah, it's a problem. Allergens are always there. Allergens are always a top recall type of issue. Lately, it's in salad dressings, bakery, our famous mac and cheese. Please don't touch the mac and cheese. We gotta leave that. It's a sacred dish. Metal in bakery. Metal, comes and goes. People, I don't have to worry about metal anymore. It's still there. And labeling, got some infant formula labeling issues, but labeling is always a top sort of recall thing, whether it's food safety specific or not. And we got to worry about that labeling aspect. It could be related to quality or food safety. So Rebecca, so as a training provider, how do we incorporate recalls and the root causes? Because we get some information and possibly sometimes on recalls and what the root causes are. How does that get incorporated into training programs? And so that participants can learn from. Yeah, what do we do with that?
Yeah, so there are several trainings that we offer that either touch on the subject of recalls, such as the preventive controls for human foods. One of the specific chapters in the training, it's related to recalls, as it is important, and it's an important regulatory requirement that if you do have an identified hazard, you need to develop a recall plan if this hazard needs a preventive control. So that is one of the trainings that touch bases on recalls. We also include examples of recalls in all of our developed trainings in order to ensure that people understand the importance of food safety and how a non-solid food safety program can actually lead to recalls. In addition, we have developed a program or a training called Crisis Management, in which we not only touch bases on the non-food safety related type crisis, but also we have developed a hands-on exercise that walks people through a food recall and allows them also to identify the possible root cause for that particular exercise. In addition, all our instructors are very experienced, and speaking as an instructor myself, who actually experienced a live recall and 2 market actions in my lifetime, we also put our experience throughout the trainings for our attendees to actually get that information as well.
Great, excellent. Yeah, again, it's nothing better than a live example. Now, you don't want all of your people coming to training to have to experience a recall, because the whole idea is not to go there. But for those that have, yeah, you remember that, I want to go there again. And
exactly.
So the training and stuff to do that. Yeah, okay, so let's leave that there. Anthony, how about from an auditor perspective? What are the auditors, and this is auditors to the GFSI kind of recognized standard. It didn't matter, whether it's on the farm or for the chain. What are they going to be looking at that could help the sites with prevention of recalls, or if they had been in a recall? What are some of the touch points and that they're looking for?
Well, that's a good question. So, really the biggest way that, an auditor can help prevent recalls is by being thorough during an audit. So that's easy to say. So, what does being thorough actually mean? And so, really that comes down to, an auditor maybe performing trace exercises, vertical traces, spending an appropriate time in the facility to observe practices. Just stand back and watch, the operation, operate. Doing interviews with key employees. It's a lot of the audit things that you typically hear, but what it comes down to is being thorough, following up on those audit trails. So if we see something as an auditor, let's figure out what's going on. Let's interview more than one person. A big activity is evaluating activities on multiple shifts, not just the first shift. Believe it or not, recalls actually happen on more than just one shift. And so being an auditor, checking out those back shifts, the second shift, pre-operational activities, those are extremely important factors that can go into, help prevent recalls. Obviously, it's the facility's responsibility to, be compliant to the standard that they choose, but, every auditor has a responsibility to, uphold those sites to the compliance. And if they're not compliant, to, document those deviations. That goes a long way. I mean, look, at the end of the day, a site doesn't wake up and decide they're really excited to be audited that day. It's a part of the industry and it's a part of it, but it's what do we do with that information? Can we take that as value added and look at a way to improve our systems, or do we look at it as an opportunity where it's just this inconvenience and all those type of things? So an auditor can help provide that information and give you that roadmap to improvement. And then from a CB perspective, obviously, we are the body that's hiring and developing auditors. So it's really up to us to train auditors on these types of auditing techniques and the expectations. And so, it's really a shared responsibility across the site, the auditor, and the certification body. And we all work together. So, generally, obviously, we can't, come on site and tell you how to work through things, but we're in this as a team. So, we provide the auditor, which can help provide the service for a client, and then in turn make their processes better and try to help prevent those recalls.
So when there's, from a regulatory perspective, I mean, obviously, they can enforce recalls, and they do enforce recalls. Yep. And you have a registry that they have to do that. So you've got that interaction happening with recall. And I just go back to anybody who wants to answer this. All the GFSI standards have a mandatory requirement for a recall management system. Yep. Some have more details than others in terms of all the specific actions, but generally speaking, that's correct, right? That they all have a need for a recall.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, so Jessica, this one for you then. So I'm at a site, I'm a certified site, I'm certified by SCS. I have a recall. You know, what am I required to do with respect to notifying the CB? Because you know, you and your team, you're constantly communicating with sites on, you know, various things. Where does that fit into that communication? What happens then?
Absolutely. So in a typical situation, generally what would happen is the site would notify us as the CB within 24 hours of the recall happening, or whatever, whether they get a warning letter or similar. In that case, then once they notify us, then we will do an investigation with that site to see what happened with the recall. And from there, we would then inform that client of what that outcome of that review was. Some potential outcomes could be, it might trigger an additional on-site audit, or maybe we would have to come back and look at corrective actions, or maybe even looking at corrective actions at the next audit. So it really depends on a case-by-case situation of what the parameters were of that recall, as well as looking through the lens of the standard that they're audited to. So if they're audited to a GFSI standard, the requirements for how a recall is handled varies a little bit. Granted, there's a lot of similarity, but that's generally what to expect.
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it does vary from standard to standard or scheme to scheme. So it's important that the site knows specifically what the standard says they have to do. From an auditor's perspective, Anthony, I'm sure that if the standard says, hey, you've got to notify, you know, your standard scheme within a period of time or some frequency, do the auditors look for that within the recall procedures that they have on the site?
Yeah, absolutely. Those parameters are always a part of the audit. Typically, there are requirements to time requirements to notify the scheme owner as well as the certification body. Generally, those are 24 hours. It does vary a little bit scheme to scheme, but there are requirements that have to be written into procedures, you know, stating that they will notify that scheme owner and the CB in the event of any recall or regulatory warning. Question that comes up too, and I'm going to just expand on that. You know, just getting a 483, generally that does not require notification, but if it does lead to a warning letter, then it does require that notification. So there's always some questions about that. So I wanted to kind of throw that in there, but yeah, all these programs all have recall requirements and communication.
So this is all happening. I'm a site and I'm doing a recall. So I gotta, you know, my first thing is I gotta, you know, get a communication out. I gotta get product that's in the marketplace back. There's a lot going on. So they've got to remember, you know, all this sort of interaction that's happened, and that should be a planned approach, I suspect, and that's in the recall procedure, so they're not making it up. So Radojka, when you get companies that are coming in for training and stuff, and you know, what's their fear? What are they panicking about at this point in time? You've been through it. Where are the big problem areas that are going to come back? Because if they don't let the CB know, like, the CB can pull the certificate, right, if they think it's at risk. So that's not going to be helpful to them either.
So one of the things that we emphasize on our GFSI trainings is the requirements as to how to communicate with the CBs when they are in a situation of recall. There are questions around, you know, am I going to lose my certification? In some cases, there are some programs such as SQFI that will look at that as part of non-compliance, and the CB might have to remove the certificate. In some other instances, it depends on the program itself. I think that one of the fears, I guess, that people have itself in the recall is to actually experience the recall. And as a quality assurance professional myself, I thought when I started my career, I would never experience that. So one of the things I convey to my students is that never say never, just be prepared, have all the documentation needed in order to ensure that you show compliance when the inspector shows up. They would look into your food safety plan or your HACCP plan, depending on what regulation you fall into. And nowadays, they would look also into associated documents such as sanitation, allergen management programs, etc. As far as you understand your programs and you're standing in a solid ground of your process and your food safety plan, the outcome of the recall could be a lot more favorable than having to explain gaps in your system. So my recommendation from anybody, every time I train or talk to people in the industry, I did a little bit of consultation as well, is to have all your food safety programs solid, and not only in a reading manner, but also as a living program. I think that, sometimes we have the best intention to develop our programs, but then the implementation, we can find some gaps. So my recommendation, especially if you are in a recall situation, that your recall program is solid, that is well implemented, that the parties understand what the role is, and of course have all your food safety associated documentation on hand and available for review and well implemented.
Yeah, I think, before we leave the topic of recalls and move on to enforcement, I think what we bring into the training programs, and then participants can get is, what do we learn from these recalls? So I started off with a list of this is just a list from a little bit of Q4 and a little of last year and Q1 of this year, and it's like, okay, so if I'm growing mushrooms, there's a salmonella or a listeria outbreak on mushrooms. Can't say it's never going to happen to me. It's okay, what can we learn from that? So finding out these very specific recalls in specific industry sectors, and if it speaks to what you make and where you are in the industry, you got to be paying attention, because it you may need to go back to your HACCP plan and say, oh, I didn't think about that. Now it's public record, and believe me, if it happened in one mushroom farm and you get a regulator coming in, they're going to know about that, and they're going to be asking you to serve your programs. And the auditors too. The auditors look at recalls, correct, Anthony? We train them. They're trained to look at those sorts of things, so they learn from that, and they know what to possibly look at and dive deeper at the site, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that industry, knowledge out there, that can go into developing, HACCP plans or preventive control plans, because it's industry, examples out there. There's evidence out there of some of these issues taking place. And so, yeah, like you mentioned, if you're a mushroom farmer and there's a mushroom recall, yeah, they need to certainly be looking at that to figure out how could that affect them, and what they can do to maybe, head that issue off or reduce that risk. Absolutely, that's key information that's out there.
And also, I should say, prepare for the unexpected. Sometimes we think that, it's unexpected, certain hazard, but then an incident happens and then the hazard emerge. A good example was the recall in 2007 for carrot juice, which had Clostridium botulinum in it. Clostridium was not considered a hazard up to that point. And, if you were a carrot juice processor at the time and you saw, you were in the recall alerts from the FDA and you saw that coming through, you would have expected the FDA at your facility at the time, and you would have been expected to take immediate action and corrections for that particular operation in your facility. So again, be prepared for the unexpected, pay attention to recalls, and ensure that your site is not indirectly affected by the recall of another facility or another company.
Okay, so lots of stuff. I mean, obviously recalls, yeah, I got my procedure, I don't have to worry about it, but there's lots to learn from this, through recalls themselves and through our training, and even from the auditors are going to come in and they're going to be questioning on this sort of stuff. And if you're not aware of it, it's good learning, and you can go back and change it and make sure that HACCP plan or food safety or preventive control plan is doing. So speaking of preventive control plans and enforcement of regulations in different sectors, let's move on to enforcement, because that's, that's when, FDA or USDA or Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or whoever, or state or public health, they're all regulatory authorities that may be your regulatory authority having jurisdiction. That's the official word, because it varies, depends on what you make, where you ship it, all those sorts of things. So enforcement, and you can see a lot of that enforcement activity. So we're seeing more, I think COVID put a little bit of a pause on some of that enforcement of the preventive controls for human food and pet food and foreign supply and verification program, but that's going to start picking up. So with respect to those sorts of enforcement activities around, say, foreign supplier verification program, or FDA going into commissaries that were, they were making, let's say they were making desserts for the food service industry, and all of a sudden, hey, people like this desserts, I'm going to start selling it online. Okay, well, that changes dramatically, the regulation that you fall under, those sorts of things. So how do those things get incorporated into our training provision, or the things that sites and people on the call here or the webinar, Radhika, what should they be looking for to help them with all that enforcement activity that's going on?
So one of the things that I would look as a professional in the food industry, it's any FSMA training available. The FSPCA, which is part of the technical group associated with the FDA, have developed training that is specific to and approved, or recognized, I should say, recognized by the FDA, that allows to provide information regarding the regulatory realm of the new regulations that come on board in terms of the Food Safety Modernization Act. In addition, we update our own developed training based on information that we get, either because we are attending webinars that are related to regulatory information that is emerging, or because we have subscriptions to newsletters associated with the FDA, the USDA, AFDO, and other organizations. So we are in constant flux of information, and we add that as well to our trainings. So if there is a warning letter or a update of information from a regulatory standpoint, then we get that information through those vehicles that I just explained, and we add them to our trainings as well. A good example recently is the fact that sesame seeds, for example, it's being added to the US allergen group. And so we are adding that into our allergen management portions to some of our trainings as part of, information. And even though the enforcements will not start until 2023, it's good for people that are actually processing foods that contain sesame seed to be on board with these new regulatory status for this particular ingredient.
And I think from past experience, you can expect that when there's an addition to or change to the, say, the allergen list, that's gonna have some focus on enforcement. And
yes.
So I use the example a number of years ago, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency added mustard to the allergen list in Canada, and just a ream of recalls, and that gets very expensive. So knowing these regulatory changes and the possible enforcement, encourage those on the webinar to get in front of that, because it may or may not be an issue for you, but get in front of it. If we know it's coming down the pipeline, Anthony, I'm sure the auditors are starting to mention that again. They can't consult on it, but they can, just if they're looking, they're going to say, you got, I know you got some sesames out here. It's on your raw material listing. The regulation. If you get a blank stare, then perhaps they might be encouraging, check out some of the training on what to do with all that sort of stuff, or be aware of that sort of stuff. So in terms of those the regulations themselves, Anthony, part of, correct me if I'm pretty sure almost every GFSI standard has the site shall meet the regulation that applies to them as a bare minimum. So what do the auditors do to check the box on that? How do they know that the sites are meeting the regulation? Because the GFSI audit incorporates all that, but it doesn't go through a regulatory checklist.
No.
Or do you have that? So what are some tools? What are some things that they do to ensure that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that the auditor has to know what those rules are, and so every country, even different manufacturers within that country, some have rules that apply, some that don't, and so in order for that auditor to investigate and determine compliance, they have to know what they are too, and so if they don't know, the techniques don't matter, and so from our standpoint, at least at SCS, each auditor does get evaluated during their witness audit process to determine that they understand those regulations, because if they don't know them, they're not adding any value to any clients or any audits by any means. Now depending on the type of operation, a lot of it comes down to records and observations. And so, this could be related to an SQF 15. So, a canning process, so FDA filed cooking processes, that requires better process school, a process authority, checking those boxes to make sure that all those cooks are up to date, they're filed, there's calibrations that have taken place, validations, all that good stuff that goes into it. Could be pesticide usage in fields, and so a lot of it comes down to, again, records, observations, interviews with the key employees that are performing some of those functions. Other things that come to mind would be maybe mycotoxins in pet foods, and so observing maybe a corn truck coming in, or observing that testing process. Medications and animal feed comes down to it again, looking at medical usage reconciliations. Again, it's really just knowing what those requirements are, and then demonstrating that knowledge during the audit. And again, it's interviews, records, observations. It's knowing what to expect when you go into a facility, and ensuring that those records are in place, that the proper reaction to those records are in place. A lot of it is in that interview phase as well, after that standpoint. So a lot of folks may know what to do, but it's what do you do when things don't go the way that they're intended, because it's manufacturing. It's going to happen. There's going to be an over delivery. There's going to be an under delivery. Something's going to happen. It's just how do you respond to those situations is what makes it different between a recall and not a recall. And so that interview process for those employees is really critical on all shifts in all those key areas, because they're the ones that make that decision right now. Do they elevate it? Do they shut the machine down? What do they do to prevent that product from potentially reaching the marketplace? That's the critical juncture.
What about on the, do they pull labels and look at the label compliance? Because that varies from, again, where is it being shipped to, right? So
Yep.
They can look at a label and say, yeah, it's not compliant. And that's both a regulatory issue and a labeling issue, and so they can do that way as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even Doika just mentioned Sesame coming out in 2023. That doesn't mean that we start implementing it in 2023. That means it all has to be ready to go when that date hits. And so day one, it's expected to be fully implemented. And so labels now, right now is the time where labels need to be being rechanged, re-verified, updated, because during a vertical trace or a mock recall exercise in an audit, absolutely, labels are getting reviewed. The label inbound verification process is always going to get reviewed. How does that process work? How are new labels created? Maybe it's at a corporate office. Either way, that label creation, packaging creation, all that process is going to be included in an audit and checked. And reviewing all of our GFSI audits, I can tell you that we see our fair amount of issues where a new process, maybe in product development, was created. We've got this new product. Well, it's a different allergen, and it wasn't caught during the product development process. It wasn't caught maybe during the food safety team review of a new product, and it turned into a finding or even potentially a recall. Yeah. And we've seen it. And so yeah, that labeling process from start to finish is absolutely critical, just as it is with, you know, cooking a product. It carries potentially the same weight depending on what that label information has to tell with regards to an allergen, of course. That could be life or death for a child or an adult, depending on what it is, but it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, the label stuff. So Jessica, you mentioned earlier we were talking about the recall stuff. So, and I think Anthony may have mentioned that, like enforcement letters or anything, you know, other than recalls, other sorts of communication with a regulatory authority as part of enforcement letters, warnings, whatever else. What's the expectation of the site to notify this us, the CB, of that? And what is your team? What do we do with that information if we get it or we're aware of it back and forth? What happens there? Anything different?
No, what really happens is they have to notify us, and then we would assess what was going to happen next. So it could vary. It could most likely be a case-by-case scenario. I don't think typically a site isn't going to be suspended for their certification right off the bat for having a recall.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of an assurance to kind of give you is what's going to happen is we're going to look at what happened, why it happened, what was the issue, what was sort of the root cause of that. And depending on what that is, we might have to come right back on site and do a re-audit and go back through your process and see what happened, why it happened. Or in some cases, it could just be that maybe in the future we'll come and do a review of corrective actions at the next audit, or just looking at the, you know, how is it being handled within that facility. But the main thing is letting us know and really looking at those requirements for the standard that you're being audited to, because every single one of them has a slightly different nuanced approach in terms of how that gets reported. Some cases you have to notify the scheme owner. And that's your responsibility as the certified site, is you need to maybe go to a specific program and say, I've had this recall. We also have a commitment to do that as well. So just like the certified site has requirements, so do we as a certification body, and we uphold them. And if we have something that comes across us, then we have to also make sure that we're following those requirements. Usually it's those requirements are around deadlines in terms of how quickly we have to get that information to the scheme owner, what our action plan is. We also let them know that this is what we're doing to resolve this. They might weigh in and perhaps per se, I would like you to, you know, maybe we say we can go back at the next time, or we want to do a re-audit, and maybe they have a difference there, and we kind of come to an agreement of what that action plan will be. So there's quite a few parties involved in this discussion.
I think sites get, you know, when it comes to enforcement stuff from a regulatory authority, they really get concerned around privacy and records and all that sort of stuff. But we've got NDAs with these folks. We're not going to go public and say, hey, we had a certified site that the only thing we can do is if we suspend or withdraw their certificate, we just take it off the registry, right? I mean, we can do that. That's our obligation. But, you know, beyond that, how that gets communicated to customers, we don't do any of that, correct?
That's correct. We are not publicly involved with the information here. We're sort of, really, you could say we're a little bit more behind the scenes. So we're not going to put a, you know, social media post or inform other clients or say anything that's private information. So what we're really concerned with is how is that site handling the recall and making sure that we're in compliance with regulatory as well as this program scheme requirements that have to be upheld. So that's what we're really after. And absolutely, that's proprietary information that we wouldn't, you know, disclose.
So transparency. I mean, if you're concerned about all that sort of stuff, I think just transparency. You know, you get worse. You know, if you don't know what to do with information, at least just reach out to your CB and discuss it. Because I've seen some scenarios where, enforcement letters weren't made known to the auditor, and then 2 or 3 years later somebody comes in and it becomes public knowledge, and you end up, and that's when you can lead to suspensions, because it's you know, you're not being truthful, and you're obstructing that sort of stuff. So being aware of that. So okay, I'm just looking at time here. Let's move on to the changes and additions section of some of our discussions and stuff like that. So everybody on the webinar, there's changes around regulations, there's changes in regulations, there's changes in schemes, changes in GFSI requirements. So that's kind of lumped into change management. So Radojka, how do we, what do we do with all that sort of stuff? How do we interact from a training service provision in terms of getting that change out, and where does it show up?
So yes, as the approved training center or approved training partner in some cases, we get firsthand information from the different GFSI schemes on what changes are coming up and what trainings. A lot of the trainings, they develop the trainings. So we get the materials from them, and that's how we get to post or to provide the transitions to those changes to our clients. One change that is coming up pretty soon, it's for VRCGS, which is the standard. It's going to the next edition, and we are planning to have a transition training in fall this year. So that's for the GFSI. Last year we had changes on SQFI that went from edition 8.1 to edition 9. So we provided the training when it was available to us. As part of the regulatory changes, there are new rules that are being spoken to. Currently, one is under revision, which is the traceability rule. And my expectation is that once that rule becomes effective after the regulatory period, FSPCA will provide materials and availability for trainers to get credentialed and provide a training against that. So my estimate is that once the rule is approved and it's going to be enforced a year more or less after an approved training will come for that. And then the other rule that it's being right now discussed at the FDA level, and we went through a public comment last November, is e-commerce. As you know, with COVID, a lot of the businesses went into a more remote and delivery kind of service, which we already had at a different outlets such as Amazon and other businesses, but COVID emphasized the process. So now there is a lot of discussions around how do we ensure that food that is delivered through these processes is safe for the consumer, and therefore the FDA is looking into a rule. Like I said, they just went into the public comment last fall, so regulatory processes take some time, so I'm not expecting to see anything coming as a set rule probably in another 2 or 3 years.
But I'm glad you mentioned the e-commerce, the online, that sort of stuff, because I think I mentioned before, I could be like a commissary making a dessert, and then all of a sudden I want to ship it to customers within my region, or now if I'm starting to ship online and I'm going across state or provincial boundaries or across international boundaries, that can also change my my regulatory footprint, correct? Correct. Yeah,
yes.
Big time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, a couple of years ago when the Canadian, the CFIA came out with, or the Health Canada came up with the Safe Food for Canadians regulation, a lot of produce suppliers that were regulated provincially, kind of akin to the state regulatory authority in the US, they started shipping online and they started shipping across provincial boundaries. So now it becomes a federal law. So they came under, CFI, and they were blindsided by this. So business practice changes like that can have a huge impact in terms of your regulatory compliance and what you got to do. So being aware of that, and if you get caught and they slap their hand or they do whatever, then seeking out some more information on how to become compliant is going to be an important part of your business. So yeah. So from an auditor perspective, in terms of change and change management, Anthony, how do the auditors keep up on the changes in the standards, but also regulation, and then how do they apply that to their day-to-day service of auditing?
Yeah, that's a good one. So as an auditor, they're always required to, undergo any additional training when revisions change. So for example, when SQF Edition 9 came out, there was, some training that needed to happen. When BRC comes out later this year, like Radojka mentioned, there's training that has to be done. And so, auditors are required to, maintain that current training so that they can be at the forefront of, the auditing and the client-facing, process. If I'm an auditor and I'm working on a different change, it's 100% of the time that it's going to be audited. And so, for example, when we went from edition 8.1 to edition 9, we're going to hammer on edition 9. We want to know that those changes are number one. We want to make sure that the sites are aware of those changes, and then number two, we want to make sure that those changes have been implemented. And I think there's some confusion that always happens around implementation of changes. Those implementation dates that are provided by the scheme owners, that's the date that's expected that all those changes are in. It's not the date to start working on that. I think I mentioned that with the Sesame, because that's a critical piece. And anytime we have those revision changes, audit scores generally drop. But that's across all the schemes, because there are a lot of updates that are missed. There are a lot of changes that are not implemented. And so as an auditor's mindset, if I'm going into an audit and it's a new revision, definitely we are going to be reviewing all of those changes to see how those are implemented. That's certainly something that'll always happen.
So speaking of that change management, Jessica, what are our obligations, the certification body's obligations to communicate change to the sites? Like if they want to know about a scheme change, BRCGS or SQF or whatever it might be, or Primus GFS, there's some changes coming up in that too. Is it our obligation as a CB to communicate that to the site?
We do take that as our obligation. We do make sure that we're informing our client base of these changes. And typically the schemes are pretty vocal about these changes. So our recommendation to our clients is to make sure you're also tuning in to the regulatory as well as the scheme owners. Opt into email notifications, check their websites periodically, check to see what it is that they're putting out there, because you'll also get that information. We don't necessarily let you, reach out and say that maybe there are changes that are still not sort of solidified yet, because sometimes we're able to weigh in on potential standard changes. And in those cases, it's not really anything to act on yet. But as soon as those changes are communicated out, we recommend to make sure that you also as well are sort of just staying in tune with what's going on in the industry, as well as the FDA, USDA. Opt into those email notifications, see what's going on out there. And this way it can keep you a few steps ahead. Once we have commitment of what those changes are, we'll also make sure, especially for the schemes, with SQF or BRC updating, or Primus GFS is just updating itself for these new versions. We're making sure they're reaching out to our clients. We're providing them a summary of what those changes are. And if you go to those scheme owner websites, they all have it. They all have a very handy, useful document that will show all the changes. It's typically in red, so you can quickly skim through. They usually often even have just a change document, so you can look at that. And if you have questions about what those changes are, we'll do our best to answer them. Of course, we have limits in terms of how far we can take that, so it's not consulting, but we're absolutely here to help answer questions that you might have in terms of how a certain change might be viewed. How would we ensure that it's implemented? What types of records might we be looking for? So those are the types of things that we can potentially help you with.
Yeah, I think there's the schemes have done a good job of communicating that, and we're part and parcel of that too. So there's lots of resources to manage that change. I remember when I was auditing, it's the first thing I would and if I was going back to a site, if the site's already certified, first thing I without looking at anything else, first thing so what's changed? What's going on? What's happening? Oh, nothing. I said, oh, really? Okay. There's always something going on. So it's like, either you're going to tell me or I'm going to go look really hard, because there's always change. I want to know that you know what the changes are. Because change is good. How you manage the change, whether it's a regulatory change or a scheme change, that's the most important to me. And I don't, and auditors, I don't think they expect you to get it perfect either. They just want to know that you're trying, right? Are you trying? It may not be perfect, and they'll tell you it's not perfect, then you go about and try it again. So it's okay to air your dirty laundry, so to speak, I think, in terms of, I tried, I don't know if it's good. Why don't you let me know if it's good enough? And that's what an audit's all about as well. So, okay, we got 5 minutes left. There's a couple of questions that came in. I think we answered one of them already. Here's a good one. I'm just gonna throw it out there because it's like, what is the most difficult audit scheme? Like,
so I'll tackle that one real quick. I'll give and again, this is my opinion. And so I think it varies because I get this a lot. And so if you are brand new into the auditing third-party world and you're starting your first quality and food safety management program, my recommendation is go in SQF or BRC because it's a little more prescriptive. It's going to help you, it's going to help kind of identify what some of those requirements are. FSSC, in my opinion, is a great scheme. It's my personal preference if I was going to implement a program because it gives you a lot of flexibility to make it a specific, make it specifically to your operation. But it doesn't quite give you a lot of the examples on how to do things. There's not implementation guides out there like there are for SQF and BRC. And so you have to, in my opinion, I think you have to have a little bit more experience to implement an effective FSSC program, whereas SQF and BRC are still difficult, don't get me wrong, but they do give you a little bit more of the roadmap on how to get there. It'll tell you on an annual basis, you need to do this food defense challenge, or it gives you a little bit more prescriptive information on how to go about doing that. So they're all great.
What do you think they mean by difficult? Because they're all benchmark. You're going to get you're going to be safe. You're going to be safe, and they all require you to meet regulation, whatever it is, right? So
absolutely.
So the difficulty comes in what? Understanding, tools, a combination of all that.
Yeah. I think difficulty can certainly be tools. I think I mentioned a little bit of that is, from like an FSSC perspective, they give the scheme and kind of go from there. Whereas, maybe SQF or BRC, there are implementation guides. There is information out there from an FSSC standpoint. And from a difficulty perspective, Frank, you kind of hit it. They're all covering a lot of the same things. They all have document control programs. They all have their, verification and validation. They're all hitting a lot of the exact same types of information. There are differences in scoring. There's differences in terminology. There's differences on re-audit processes. And difficult is certainly that's just a personal kind of an opinion there. And so I think just picking the right scheme for your operation is more important than what's difficult and what's not. So just trying to find that right fit for yourself.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we're getting close on time here. So, and there's a couple other questions in here. So there's a couple questions in the question box that we didn't get to, but we will respond to them. Again, we know who put them in there. There's a couple that were submitted, one or two that were little vague in what you're asking if you had submitted it as part of your registration. So we'll get back to you. So at this point, I got a couple of slides to fix up, to finish up with. Really want to thank the three of you for your wisdom and bringing to the webinar participants. I'm sure they appreciate that. And thanks so much. And talk to you soon. Talk to y'all soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's just get a couple of things just to wrap up the webinar. Obviously, in terms of SCS, we're here to help you. You heard a lot about what Jessica was talking about in terms of, the customer service and all those sorts of things. Really, with whoever your CV is, your service provider is, and your interaction between them and your regulatory authority, that transparency and that communication time is very important, and we practice what we preach in terms of doing that. Looking at when bundling, we can do some price bundling across different service providers. We also have a very extensive consulting division separate from certification that is available to help you with changes or regulatory issues that you might have. So we'd encourage you to reach out to us for that as well. There are some of our contact information for you. Again, this is going to be available to you if you don't get it down and write it down there. So you can either contact me, there's my email, Bernadette is on our sales and marketing side, and can if you have questions or looking for certification to any of those standards, she'll get you in contact with the right person on that. And then yeah, so encourage you. Our next so March 30th is our next webinar that's coming up. It's titled "The State of Play in Regenerative Agriculture: How Sustainability Certification is Evolving to Tackle Climate Change." So that's a really up and coming regenerative agriculture and sustainability and carbon neutral. Really seeing a lot of activity up there. So we really encourage you to dial into that one that's coming up on March the 30th. And so that gets us out of time. I really want to thank all of you for attending today. Hope you got something out of it, just a little nugget that helps you out. And I look forward to seeing you all in the future, hopefully in person, a lot more of that. Looking forward to that, but also just, give me a call if you got any questions on what we talked about today or in general. I'll be glad to help you. Okay, thanks so much, and take care.